Hello, welcome. Hi, my name is Felicia Van Stolk. I'm the Executive Director at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. Thank you for joining us tonight. The land on which we are gathered is the traditional and unceded territory of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswas Nation. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amamutsin tribal band. The Amamutsin are working hard to fulfill their obligation to Creator and to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amamutsin Land Trust. Thank you again for joining us. And also, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that as we're gathered here, many of our neighbors and community members, and perhaps some of you in the audience, are still actively dealing with the impacts of recent storms. So I hope that this event and our following extreme weather resource fair and guided walk along West Cliff Drive are helpful to supporting our collective understanding and our feeling of empowerment to continue to live with the powerful forces of nature that bear upon us. This presentation has come together very quickly to meet the moment, and I'd like to thank the Center for Coastal Resilience at UCSC, which has provided sponsorship and enabled us to record and live stream this event so that those who are not able to join us in person are still able to learn along with us. The new center aims to advance campus research and to partner with state and federal agencies as well as private foundations to address coastal climate change, resilience, and sustainability. I'd also like to thank the museum's members and donors, many of whom are in the audience tonight. Thank you. They help us create educational programming throughout the year. And of course, a huge thank you to our remarkable staff who really mobilized so quickly to pull these events together. So tonight, we will be hearing a keynote presentation about Perils in Paradise, the historic and geologic forces that have shaped this coastline and community, followed by 2 lightning talks focused on the future of life along the coast, including climate change and our response to it. After all 3 speakers have presented, we'll have time for Q&A, and you may submit your questions on the cards provided at the door. To get us started, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary Griggs, Distinguished Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UCSC, and the museum's first Laura Heacox Naturalist honoree. Come on up, Gary.
Welcome, everybody. I wanted to thank Felicia and the museum because when they asked me to give this talk, it was originally going to be on Zoom. I said I'd been zoomed out. So it's great to have a real audience and to be able to see people get some response. This has been great to see all those people coming in and realize there's former undergraduate students, former graduate students, midwives who delivered 3 of my children. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. That's okay. I've been at the university a long time. I've now had 16,000 undergraduate students, and you run into them in the oddest places, like your primary care physician when he's examining you for a hernia. So it's wonderful to live in a community where it's small enough to get to know people. So we definitely live in paradise. I don't think, or we wouldn't be here, but there's perils. There's things that affect us more often than we might remember. And we also have this tendency to, what I call, have a short disaster memory. As soon as a disaster occurs, we want to rebuild, understandably, and go back and fix our lives. But there's lessons to be learned. And this year in particular, we're still dealing with some of those that Tiffany will talk about. We've got West Cliff, we've got Sea Cliff. Downtown Capitola has been flooded more times than we can even remember. Personally, I keep track of time by disasters. Not long after I got here, there was the floods of 1969. And we had the floods of 73, then the weather shifted. We had the first big El Nino in 1978, and then we had an 82 big winter with Love Creek and floods, and then 83 was a big El Nino on the coast, and then we had the earthquake It just goes on, but it's a way for me to keep track of time. So that's what I want to try to talk about tonight, is give you some sort of sense of perspective. I'm not going to read all these, but just to say things are tough when we get started. It gets better, and then it gets worse. And it was sort of that way with the earth. It was a little hot, molten, not very, it was pretty inhospitable until things cooled down. And I like to think of the history of the earth like the life of a soldier. Long periods of boredom separated by short intervals of violence. And if you've ever had kids that have played soccer, I think that's the life of a goalie. But if we look at Santa Cruz County, we're the smallest in the state, forgetting San Francisco City and County, but we have more hazards per square mile. And we start at the coastline, where our coast is, in many cases, failing, collapsing. We move up into the stream valleys, where we have flooding. Up on the hillsides, we have landslides and mud flows. And then we have the mother of all hazards, the San Andreas Fault, right at the boundary. So there's plenty of things if you like to worry about those. But hopefully tonight you'll get a sense that there's plenty of safe places to live, but there's places that I would be cautious about. And certainly rainfall, which we've had a fair amount of this year, is a big factor. And as we look at the topography, it's clear that out on the coast, Davenport, Santa Cruz, average 25 to 30 inches a year over the long term. But by the time those clouds get up over the mountains, they've dropped a lot of rain. So Bonnie Doon, Boulder Creek, about twice as much. Some years, 150 inches of rain. And the kind of a rain shadow, Felton, not as much, Scotts Valley, not as much. Then we get over to San Jose, and it's a desert. I have an odd sense of humor, so you're going to have to deal with that tonight. So the winter of '82, I want to talk a little bit about comparing '82 and '83 to 2023. But in hydrology, they call this overland flow. That's when the ground gets saturated, everything starts to flow. And I think Nate might talk a little bit about atmospheric rivers, but just to say, we now know that these really rivers of moisture come across the Pacific, and they're responsible for not only providing a lot of our water supply, but also a lot of excess water in the form of floods. And this winter we had, I don't know, maybe 9 that came. Sometimes we might have 1 or 2, and those really changed the way we think about our moisture coming. And there's been some attempts to kind of compare winters of the past. I forgot I had this industrial strength laser, so I'm going to use this carefully. But we don't really know, except 1862 was probably the greatest flooding in California's history, when the whole Central Valley became a lake. But we do have rainfall records for 1982, which was very high rainfall, and then this year. And you can see both for Santa Cruz and the Santa Cruz Mountains how those 2 years compare. And one of the big differences was in '82, we had this long saturating rainfall in November, December. Then we had this spike in the first several days of January that led to things like Love Creek. Over the greater San Francisco Bay Area, we had 18,000 mud flows. It was very different. This year it's been sort of spread out a little more, but we did have, again, in the last of December, the first couple of weeks of January, a fair amount of rain. And this is up in the mountains. You can see similar patterns. Again, this 1982 peak in early January. But rainfall is about twice as high as it is in the city. So San Lorenzo River, which we're actually on the floodplain here. That shouldn't be a surprise. So it's a pretty small basin, 139 square miles, and from one end to the other, water only takes about 12 hours to get from one end to the other. So when we have a flood, it's generally gone pretty quickly. On the Mississippi, it can be in flood stage for 2 months because it's draining, almost half the continent. So this is from the official U.S. Geological Survey stream gauging station in Felton. And it goes from the last week in December up to a week or so ago. And these are these pulses of water that are coming down following each of those atmospheric rivers. So we can see the peak here in January whatever it was, 6th or 7th, reached 18,500 cubic feet per second, which is kind of an odd number to keep track of, but that's equivalent to 138,000 gallons, and that would fill an Olympic swimming pool in just a little less than 5 seconds. So that's how much water in Felton was going by near where the state park is there. So, but you can see these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can see those 9 rivers because it drains pretty quickly, which means it can flood pretty quickly before we're really aware of what's happening. Probably read a bit about Felton Grove. You may know it. I don't know if any of you live there. I'll be careful what I say then if you do live there. So as you come down Graham Hill Road or the bypass now from Scotts Valley, Felton Grove is sort of, here's the covered bridge. It's this low-lying area right next to the San Lorenzo River. And it's on, we usually think about floodplains like the 100-year floodplain. Maybe it floods plus or minus every 100 years. This is about the 3-year floodplain. So the biggest floods in this century were in Christmas 1955 that went through downtown Santa Cruz. We didn't have the flood control project. So these are the aerial photos that were taken in June, 6 months later. So this is sand, white sand that's very reflective that was deposited by those flood flows. So it went clear over on the other side of Graham Hill Road. And you can see that's sort of the high water mark. So all of Felton Grove was flooded. Graham Hill Road was underwater. So that was a really big event. And if we look at the old newspaper accounts, this is 1938. And if you read this, I can't read it from there. Every one of these say Felton Grove flooded. People moved out. Some cabins were carried downstream. So 38, 55, 58, 67, Felton Grove was awash. 12 people were taken out of their homes in boats. So Felton Grove gets hits repeatedly. And I had a friend who recently asked me about buying a house there. And I said, well, I gave her some advance warning, and I said, you know, I tried to tell people when they're looking at a house, would I live there? And I said, I really wouldn't live there. And I gave her the background, the history, but she said, well, they elevated this house. So this is 1982 again, January 3rd, 4th, 5th. So this is a Volkswagen van, if you couldn't recognize it. And this, if you looked really carefully, you can see there's a sort of a bathtub ring here. So the water was up to the roof in Felton Grove. The next spring, they bought a new Volkswagen. And it's all cleaned out, and somebody else is renting it. This is another house from 82. So this is now, 40 years ago. These are those cars you see on Craigslist that are really cheap. After hurricanes, these are also sold. You have to be a little careful, but the high water was right there. Again, you could see it. I was up there taking pictures. You could see the level of the water. So when sediment's moving, it means the water's a lot deeper than that. The next spring, it was all cleaned up. And then I came back in 2017, and it had been raised. This part they saved and they built. I don't know why they saved that, but so some have been elevated and some have not. And there's still a lot of low-lying places. This is in January. So Felton Grove, if you're thinking about buying there, talk to me. Well, you don't have to talk to me. Just don't. 6 years ago, in 2017, the museum sponsored a talk at the Rio. And I have to say I was really excited. Well, first I was going to be embarrassed because they said they want to do this first at Hickok's lecture, and they said they're going to rent the Rio. And I said, are you kidding? It holds 600 people. There's going to be 4 people in the front row. Anyway, it was a wonderful audience. But in that talk, I gave a Between Paradise and Peril with some of these images. But I showed this ad from Lighthouse Realty, and I was trying to show these houses that you could buy this whole thing for a family compound for only Not very much. And I don't know Peter Cook, but he was in the audience, and his son, maybe 10 years old, blurted out in this audience full of people, "Dad, there's your picture." So in the ad, this is one of these cabins for a family compound, and this is that same house, but if you look carefully, you can see sort of a dirty ring here. That's where the high water was in 2017. And this house, you can see it faintly over here. So this is Felton Grove and this repeated flooding. And this is, a couple weeks ago, the same two houses keep getting flooded. So, you know, it's not fun to be flooded. So I'm not trying to make fun of these people, except to say realtors do what they can, but I don't think they often understand. It says nothing in here in this ad about, you know, ideal cabins for your family, and it's close to Felton and the White Raven coffee shop and the covered bridge, but it doesn't say it's very close to the San Lorenzo River. So we are not isolated from that, and all the water that comes out of that 140 square mile watershed comes down into the river channel. And those are the edges of the floodplain. And we're sitting right here. It's not going to flood tonight, we're good. But the Native Americans did not live down here. In fact, the first settlers did not live down here. It was until the gold rush, and the mission, the first sort of beginnings of a mission was out here by sort of near Costco, and they got flooded, and finally there was this long series of correspondence with the viceroy in Mexico City saying, you know, we can't build here. So they moved up on top of the hill, but gradually people came down and said, well, this is great soil for a garden, let's build down here. And then the county courthouse was built here, and gradually we occupied the whole floodplain. Unless you live on Beach Hill or up here, which is perfectly safe. So this is a really old picture from 1866. And this is the river before it was confined. You can see Holy Cross, I think, over there. But it was a really broad floodplain. In fact, out on the edge was sort of a marsh, and there was actually Chinatown out there where Trader Joe's and all those stores are today was Chinatown. But that's what we gradually encroached on. So these are flood years in Santa Cruz. When the newspaper said the lowlands flooded, so it's interesting. It was every 10 years for a while. There's a few gaps in here. These are the really big ones, 1862, 1940, 55, 82. So flooding in Santa Cruz is extremely common, and the old newspapers have all these records. So this is 1940. I don't know if anybody can recognize where this is. It's from Ocean View Avenue. So you're looking down, this would be Beach Hill. There's the Riverside Avenue Bridge. But this whole area down here called the Barson Street Flats flooded all the time. So the river is just taking that land. You can see something about the elevation of the water. This is the big 55 flood, Christmas floods. So this is Laurel and Front Street. So there's, if you're into basketball, this is about the Warriors Arena. So this is all underwater. This would have been the mall, Pacific Avenue. And this is in front of the fire station. So it flooded fairly often. And 55 Corps of Engineers had been asked to do a flood control project. It was based on a 1940 flood. It was way too small. They increased the size. So this was the map of where the 55 flood went. So we're right here, right on the edge of it, and this would be Pacific Avenue and where the courthouse is today. This is the area next to Highway 1 where PetSmart and Staples and Ross for Less all are on that stretch of floodplain, as well as these apartments and a lot of other things. So it's flooded all over. The 100-year flood is actually out here someplace, but in fact, that event in 1955 was the 30-year flood. It was way above the 100-year floodplain. So there's problems in designating floodplains. This is the project under construction, and to make a long story shorter, they did something they'd never done before in Santa Cruz, and we're still dealing with that. The city fathers and mothers, I think it was mostly fathers then, decided they wanted to reclaim all that land that was Chinatown that built out in the marsh. So instead of building a wide channel, they built a narrow channel to get more land back, and then they deepened it. So they deepened it in a way they call below bed containment. So at the mouth, they deepened it by about 12 feet. So they artificially lowered the bottom to provide more volume. Well, what would a river do? It just filled it in. So now we're dealing with too much sediment. That's sort of an ongoing thing with the Corps of Engineers. So again, 1982, how many were here in 1982? Oh gosh, welcome. I'm glad you're still here. So it scoured out some of that bottom, and the Soquel Avenue Bridge actually collapsed. And there's the high water mark. These are all the phone cables. So if you can believe it, we didn't have iPhones yet. We didn't have cell phones, so all the phone connections went out. But this shows what can happen during about a 30-year flood. This is looking up from the Water Street Bridge back upstream towards Highway 1. I mean, there was a lot of water. This is Branciforte Creek that's in a channel. Again, in hydrology, they call that bank full discharge. It's as much as it can carry. This is this last winter. So we have drones now, which are amazing. So you can see this sort of a line up here, which is where the high water was. So not as high, but it was pretty good flood coming out of the basin. This is kind of the turn, the Riverside Avenue Bridge, where it heads towards the boardwalk. And this is the comparison between the 55 flood and the 82 flood in this last winter. This is in Felton at the San Lorenzo. You can see those 2 years were just about the same, about a 30-year event. And this winter was a little more than half of that. Soquel Creek, very similar. So a lot of water, but not nearly as much as we've had in past floods. Soquel in 1940 flooded like downtown Santa Cruz did. This is the main intersection of Porter and Soquel. And they had a problem also in 82. That intersection is up here. The fire station's right here. It's underwater. Good place to build a fire station. So this is what happened in 55. They had a bridge with a low arch, and it got stuffed up with timber and logs and debris, and then it just spread out through the town. And the same thing happened in 82. Because that low arch, it trapped all kinds of debris that came down out of the basin. So there was a big, well, there still is, mobile home park, and the water just diverted and went right through the park. And mobile homes really weren't built to handle floods. And there's another way to say that. They didn't do very well, and people that were living in there didn't know it was flooding until it came into their homes. And these are generally older people, maybe not as mobile as some of you young people out there, all of you young people. So this is Soquel Creek, looking at the gauging station in Soquel. Again, you can see it went from, I say, drought, like the San Lorenzo, to flood in days, which we're not really used to. And you can count these 1, 2, 3, roughly 9 atmospheric rivers. And this is not as much water as the San Lorenzo. It's a smaller basin, but still 60,000 gallons a second, so you could fill an Olympic swimming pool. I'm giving you that for some sort of comparison. So it flooded again this year, downtown Soquel. When I was younger, I would run around and take all these pictures. Now I depend on people like Shmuel and Kevin of Lookout. So this is not fun when it gets into your house, but that's what downtown Soquel is built on. So in addition to the floods, we had debris flows and landslides, particularly in 82. And this has to do with the rainfall sort of intensity and duration. And this is different than this year. So January 3rd, 4th, 5th, we had 32 hours of rain that was about 30 to 50% of the average annual rainfall fell in those 32 hours. And that was on top of an above average November, December rainfall. So as I said before, there was something like 18,000 debris flows over the larger San Francisco Bay Area. 33 people died. A lot of homes were damaged. And these were the kinds of things that happened in '82. So Scotts Valley, a small slump. Bonnie Doon, sort of a slump to a debris flow. Boulder Creek, trees coming down. And out on the beach, on the cliffs in Rio Del Mar, where the cliffs failed. The worst disaster was up in Love Creek above Ben Lomond, and they got 30 inches of rain in November and December, and then about 20 inches in 32 hours. So what happened basically was, this is the Monterey Shale, which is a very impermeable formation, and there's about 30 feet of weathered rock and soil and trees on top of it, and it just liquefied. This is sort of like concrete, and it just slid down about 600,000 cubic yards. How much is that? Would that fill this room up? Think about a dump truck is holding 10 cubic yards. That's like 60,000 dump truck loads came down that hill, covered 9 houses and 10 people. I went up there, the first one up there the next morning, a geologist, and saw what had happened, and it was really hard to imagine the scope and the scale. But this was Love Creek that was filled with pieces of Christmas presents and furniture and clothes, and under there were 10 people that they never really found. So a major disaster that had subsequent problems because there was other cracks on the hillside, and the county thought it wasn't safe, which is probably true, so people had to move out. I lived in Bonnie Doon at the time, and I got an urgent call. I needed to come home. So I drove up from the university on Empire and started down Smith Grade. And I had this message to get home early. Get home fast. And I saw this, and I went, oh, it's a long way around. I either got to go all the way back into town, then all the way up the coast and up Bonnie Doon Road, or all the way up to Bonnie Doon Road and back down. So I said, I was trying to be the good husband, get home for the kids. So I did that. I drove over that. And I came back the next day. I kind of did this little cartoon. I was imagining the newspaper front page story saying, geologist dies driving over landslide. So as a little addition here, this was my daughter, Callie, who was delivered by Karen Lang, who's in the audience tonight. Thank you, Karen. Holding her Cabbage Patch doll. And just 4 months ago, she got married. She's now 41 years old. So reminds me that I must be 41 years older than that. 39. Close enough. So one of the things that typically happens when we have a long duration saturating rainfall, then a high intensity rainfall, is things can liquefy and we get debris flows or mud flows, which is like Montecito suffered a couple of years ago. But long saturating rainfall can get into the subsurface, cause deeper seated slides. So this was, or slumps. This was up in Felton. That was me a long time ago. And I went up and they disconnected the gas pipe. I came back a day later, and it just moved another 2 feet. So things can happen slowly, but they're still devastating. So we did have some landslides, slumps this winter up in Ben Lomond that I think they've just finished clearing, but it's not open yet. And you're kind of looking at this, and he's looking at his phone. He's not figuring out what to do next. And they're trying to, they got the hard hats trying to figure out what do we do here. So they've cleared it up. This is it from the air from a drone. You can see the size of that. Don't buy that house either. And then any of you that commute on 17 will realize that was a bit problematic, and then the snow added to it. So we have had some slides, but nothing like the 18,000 in '82. And then Glenwood Drive, so problems scattered around. So the coast I wanted to end with, we kind of have two types of erosion. Cliff erosion, somebody might recognize this as Depot Hill in Capitola. Call me if you're going to buy a house on top of Depot Hill. I don't need the money, but I would just try to caution you. A number of reasons you get these giant blocks failing, but that's a one-way retreat. It doesn't come back. Then we can have beach erosion. So it's beach in the summer, it's beach in the winter, but it comes back again. So beach is one thing, cliffs is something else. So if we look at Depot Hill, that first picture was taken here someplace. Back in '72, there was some apartments here and a house, and you could drive the whole length of Grand Avenue. If you've been out there recently, you can't. So this keeps happening. This was just 2 years ago. This is the scale of the failure. The crest apartments after the earthquake, foundations were compromised. So if you look at it today, those apartments are gone. This house is gone, and Grand Avenue stops. So this is eroding at about a foot per year on average. So a problem. Similarly, if you go to Aptos Seascape, which is a long, painful story, you might ask, don't we own the beach? Why are they built out on the beach? And that's a longer story, but Aptos Seascape was a pretty big development before the Coastal Commission was established. So that's where the shoreline was. So they encroached quite a ways out onto the beach. And this was the winter of '83 now, not '82, but '83. We had a big El Nino with elevated sea surface. Maybe 8 storms came at times of high tides. So this riprap that was going to absorb that energy acted like a ramp, came right up over that into these houses. They've rebuilt that with a big seawall, but still they're sort of encroaching on the beach. And then if you go a little further, actually back the other way, we're on Beach Drive in Rio Del Mar, and this was hammered this last winter, but again, they built out on the beach. And if there's sand under your house, I want to say you don't have to have a mind like a rocket scientist. You could say maybe not a mind like a marine biologist or something, but that was the shoreline. And this is '83 again, so the waves are coming over that wall into the first floor and the garages. I don't know, some pictures don't need any explanation, but you know, it's for sale. I don't have anything against Cheshire Realty, but we've got plywood and sandbags. Most of the houses on Beach Drive have these makeshift seawalls. They put planks in here. They even number to tell you how to put it back together again. So this happened again this winter. God, I'm really hitting the real estate people hard tonight. So if you read this down here, it says you're behind the private gates on Rio Del Mar, and it's on the sand. And that's not a good place to be, except you have a great view. So in '83, the walls that existed, the seawalls were undermined and battered. The sand levels dropped about 8 feet, and a lot of houses ended up on the sand that have now been rebuilt. So this is what happened in '83. These are the predicted high tides over January, February, March. They were higher because of an El Nino event. And these are measurements of offshore wave gauges and one that's a little closer. So you can see these really big storms happen to come at the highest tides. And that's exactly what happened in first week of January. So this is this year, those same houses. Water came across that really wide Rio Del Mar beach over these rocks. And that's not part of their landscaping. Kind of messy. Well, it could have been a lot worse. I don't know why it stopped right there. So if you look at Rio Del Mar, this is back about 1890. So those houses were down here on the beach. And this was a big estuary lagoon. It was called the Rio Del Mar Flats. But it was completely filled in. And then they built this channel. In fact, they put a little dam here, and this was a freshwater swimming pool, and there's a swimming club there. But in 1983 winter, it came over that seawall and into the Esplanade area, and then it happened again this winter. So these places have been hit repeatedly. One of my favorite places is Sea Cliff. I don't know if any of you have mobile homes like to recreate out there. They love it. They really rough it here. It's kind of funny to go down the middle of summer and you see these, 7-foot wide video screens. They're watching movies anyway. But this has been a problem ever since it was built, originally in the late 20s. So this is taken in 1941. They built the wall down here initially in 1926. It was destroyed within a couple of years. Then they built the second wall, and it was destroyed. And they keep moving back over the years. So wall have been built and destroyed 7 times now. This is after the 83 winter. It had been built in November. It was destroyed in January. It was going to last 20 years, and it lasted about 60 days. And the next time they built it, they said they're going to make it stronger, and they tried a couple of things. They put these U-bolts here to hold these planks on the back, and they put what they called sacrificial bumpers on the front. So when the logs came through, they wouldn't destroy it. So this is what it looked like, and this is what it looks like now. So 7 times it's been built and destroyed, and each time essentially the same way. So the question now is, what are they going to do? And state parks, I'm sure, is going to be under pressure to rebuild for the recreational vehicles and all the other people. But I think it's a question we need to stop and ask ourselves. How many Band-Aids do we put on? If we're going to do it again because of use, let's build it stronger. And Capitola is also right on the sand. These are the oldest condominiums on the California coast, built in 1927 or 28, but they're virtually on the sand, as is Capitola. So people said, wow, look at the pier. It was broken up, and it happened in 1913. So it's not the first time. This was a hotel that sits sort of right at the south end of that beach, and it had water up on the second floor in 1926. And this is right along the Esplanade. There's the Venetian Court Apartments, 1926, 1931, 1940. And the newspaper accounts say, yeah, Capitola was hammered again. Pier, I think they're going to rebuild this pier versus the Seacliff Pier. You've probably seen this picture, Zelda's, but I think they're open for business again. This is that disaster memory that's very short. And then outside, I mean, it was rough down there. And this is the Capitola Lagoon in '83. And my favorite places, the Venetian Court. It's on the beach. You could buy this a couple years ago for $4.8 million. Not all of them, just this one. I'm really hitting the real estate people hard tonight. Huh? And this was a couple of weeks ago in January, so the water came in and filled them with sand and so forth. So what happened in January was very similar to what happened in 1983. So this is the tide gauge and what it was supposed to be in height and what it really was. So it's up around 7 feet plus. And that highest tide was exactly when the largest waves occurred, measured offshore at 28 feet. So that combination is when the most serious damages occurred along our coast. So Westcliff, Westcliff, Tiffany, good luck on your talk. So what's the message? Should I move to Kansas? Take my chance in California. We didn't talk about earthquakes. This was 1989. So, we live in a great place, a lot of wonderful place to live, a lot of places that I would be careful about. So if you want to read a lot more, we have this book out there. And if I made $1 million on it, I'd give it all back to you. But it covers all these things and more. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Griggs. All of the historic photos are so cool, and well, seeing those older images that are so similar to the images that have come out of just a couple of months ago, it's just a really dramatic reminder that we've been feeling these impacts basically as long as folks have been developing here. Some things have changed, but clearly some things haven't. I think I've actually heard you say it before. I've definitely heard that people say that natural disasters are only disasters because of how they impact humans. But to nature, these events are just normal cycles, they're normal processes at work. But actually, there are changes happening within those natural cycles and systems on local and global scales. And those changes are driven largely by humans impacting nature. So understanding how nature and humans have collided and cooperated throughout history is a really important foundation for planning for the changes ahead. And I hope we can all keep these lessons and these images in mind for our next two talks as we turn our attention to the future of living in this perilous paradise. And a reminder, after these talks, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So, to provide us with a forecast of what extreme weather and climate will look like along the Central Coast, please welcome Dr. Nate Mantua, the NOAA Program Lead of Landscape and Seascape Ecology for Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Doctor?
All right, so that was a pretty tough act to follow, Gary. I have one historic photo that I will share with you, and Gary mentioned this incredible flood event in January of 1862 that just pummeled California, and actually the entire West Coast states all suffered mightily during that winter, but California especially. The Central Valley was inundated for weeks, and parts of Sacramento were under 20 to 30 feet of water, and that lasted for over a month of inundation. And the Central Valley was basically an inland sea during that time period. And that was not the only time that happened. That even going back into the early 1800s, they had repeated large flood events that had done similar things. Of course, the development didn't look anything like it did during the time that photograph was taken and that image was drawn up. And there's paleoclimate evidence now that suggests mega floods have hit California on average about every 200 years, but not on any regular time frame. You know, maybe 100 years, maybe 300 years, but there have been a whole series of these kind of events that have hit this state. And yeah, California has a really volatile climate, and it has for a very long time. There is this quote that I pulled from East of Eden, John Steinbeck, and it never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years, and during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. It was always that way. And he was really talking about farmers in nearby valleys. Gary talked a lot about Felton Grove, and I guess there's been a lot of not remembering there. The map at the top right is one that USGS scientist Mike Dettinger put together that is really striking to me, and the color of the dots indicate how variable the water year's rainfall or precipitation is compared to the long-term average. And you can see California really stands out. It has all those green dots. It's like 30 to 40% of the year-to-year variation around that average. Southern California, even more extreme, up to almost 70%. And compare that to, say, the eastern half of the country, it's more like 10%. They have a much less volatile rainfall climate, precipitation climate. The Midwest is somewhere in between. You go to the Northwest, and it's just a lot more reliably wet. And California is reliably wild. And you can see the water year precipitation from 1900 to about 2016 in that graphic in the middle part of the graph on the right, showing just kind of decade to decade variations and the big spikes between years that really stand out, like 1982 or like 1997, 98. More recently, 2017 was a really wet year. 2023 is on pace to maybe get into one of those categories of a really wet year. We're not there yet, but it's headed that way. The red curve in that middle panel is the number of really heavy rainfall events. So that one looks a lot like the total, right? The small numbers of big storms contribute a lot within a year to how much rain we get. And that is summarized in another way in the very bottom, the number of Pineapple Express storms. So before they were called atmospheric rivers, a lot of people called them Pineapple Express storms, especially those storms that originated from the subtropics, and you could see now in satellite imagery, plumes of moisture coming from Hawaii to the west coast. Now that's the classic Pineapple Express, and in the last couple of years, they have basically been renamed atmospheric rivers. But a Pineapple Express is really just the kind of warm flavor of an atmospheric river. And if we look back at other climate records in California, there are some things that really stand out. I do a lot of work on the ocean and how that affects our fisheries. We know that our oceans have been warming, and in fact, one of the most reliable indicators of global warming is the increased uptake of heat into the upper part of the ocean. And I didn't include that line, but it's a graphic that is just a straight line. There's almost no year-to-year variation over the whole globe because the heat capacity of the ocean is so enormous. And if you look over the top few hundred meters or even a few thousand feet, that number just keeps climbing steadily, one year after the next. And over 90% of the excess heat that's being trapped by the rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is going into the ocean. So it is slowing down global warming, but it is giving it an incredible thermal inertia. We see off the west coast, the map at the lower right is the sea surface temperature trend from 1982 to 2021. The red colors indicate warming. The little tiny blue patches in a few places indicate cooling. Interesting, I grew up in Bodega Bay. There's a little blue there. I didn't go in the ocean in Bodega Bay. It's too cold. But if you blow this up globally, almost the entire global ocean at the surface has these kind of warming trends. And yeah, in the top right, you can see Southern California at La Jolla Cove. You have the strong warming trend, and Pacific Grove, southern end of Monterey Bay, a warming trend not quite as dramatic. And Trinidad Bay also has this warming trend, and then lots of variation. And even out in the ocean, we've had extreme events not so long ago. 2014, 15, 16 was the 3 warmest years in the Northeast Pacific on record. 3 warmest years along the California coast in what we call the California Current, which extends from Vancouver Island all the way down to Baja. And that was incredibly disruptive to marine life. And it was a kind of temperatures that are projected out for 30, 40, 50 years into the future that persisted here for 3 years. Surface temperatures over land, the state of California has lots of year-to-year variation. That top right curve, the annual averages in the light line that has a lot of wiggles, 11-year running average in the red line, and you could see that there were some cold decades and warm decades. As you go back in the early 1900s, we haven't had a cold decade since the 50s. And it just keeps going up. And there are occasionally cold years relative to those around it. This year is going to probably come out, at least this winter, is going to be a cold winter relative to all the years in the recent past, but it's not a cold winter compared to the early 1900s. Our annual precipitation statewide is shown in the blue bars in the lower right, and you can see that as a really noisy time series. That's that one that I said represents how volatile our year-to-year precipitation is in this state. And something that is really unusual and alarming about this record is how much more variation there has been in the past 5 or 6 decades compared to the previous 6 or 7. That the red curve is a measure of how much variation there is, a standard deviation over a 30-year window. And that really jumped up in the 80s and has stayed really high to present. And part of what that is capturing are the multi-year droughts that have been very frequent in the 80s and 90s, 2000s, up to 2020s. And these periods of really heavy rainfall. So you see some of the biggest spikes are just in the latter half of that record. And that 82, 83 winter is the tallest spike in that graphic that Gary talked about. And we see it in our stream flow records as well. And this is a chart that was pulled out of a recent research article that looked at both rainfall and stream flow at different seasons of the year. And this is just looking at the trends in the big flows, so the 90th percentiles, the ones that are kind of out there at those spikes that you saw in the hydrographs that Gary was talking about, that throughout most of the state, you see increasing trends over the last 7 decades or so. So we have a very consistent set of records painting this picture about how volatile the climate has been in the past, and that it's getting more volatile through the last few decades especially. And California has an incredible set of research institutions, the University of California being in the middle of all that. And I have a few graphics that I pulled from recent work that's been done at University of California, Los Angeles, and also at Scripps Institution, down at UCSD. This one is a summary of what the sort of overall picture is for our precipitation climate going forward under scenarios that consider increasing concentrations of greenhouse gas continuing on to the end of the century. And this is a comparison from the last 2071 to 2090 with 1996 to 2005. So they use climate models to do these experiments. And what happens is you have an overall increase in precipitation by about 25%. That warming continues, so 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that results in substantial reduction in snow overall in the mountains, that as the snow lines rise, you get higher snowfall rates at the highest elevations where it's still cold enough to freeze, but there's a lot more area below that that is now just generating rain-fed runoff. So the runoff increases substantially. And the chart at the bottom with the picture of the mountain just shows how this effect varies by elevation. And it's really these kind of 5,000 to 8,000 foot elevations where there's a lot of snowpack in most winters that feels the brunt of this loss of snow and conversion to a lot more runoff that then results in a lot more potential flooding in those watersheds that those mountain areas are feeding. And yeah, it's this combination of having a warmer atmosphere, a higher precipitation rate, a loss of snow, big runoff increases that lead to potential for much greater flood events. And then on the other side of the equation that is equally difficult and just impactful for people and for ecosystems is that as the atmosphere warms, it basically has a higher capacity to hold water vapor. It becomes thirstier on dry days, and it draws moisture out of the landscape and out of vegetation, and droughts intensify. And that is sort of the natural climate in California already, this Mediterranean climate where we have the wet season concentrated in a few months, and then we have this glorious spring, summer, fall that sometimes extends all the way to December before it starts raining again. But that starts to cause a lot of trouble when it's amplified, and especially when we don't get precipitation in the winter and when our summers are especially hot. So it dries out the landscape, and it can start crossing thresholds that lead to the kind of catastrophic wildfires that have become very common throughout the West, not just California, but all the way into British Columbia and even to Alaska in some years. So that is really what the future looks like for California. Our volatile climate is projected to become more volatile. Droughts and floods are projected to become even more extreme than they have been in the past. So it presents a very difficult set of challenges for us to keep living in this place that has hazards that look like they're going to be even more difficult. Stop with that.
All right, Thank you for framing that up for us. That we are feeling the effects of climate change already is not news to us and probably pretty front of mind for many of us. And it's important to remember that throughout the county, people are experiencing these impacts really differently and disproportionately. Many of us have actually delighted in seeing snow from the mountains all the way to the shoreline, but of course, folks living in mountain communities may not be so thrilled. Also, the flooding and rain damage that has impacted so many throughout the county, as we've seen in the images, they're still having a lot of ongoing impacts in some areas, much more than others. So I just want to make sure we keep that in mind. So from Dr. Griggs' talk and from recent experience, we do know that as a community, we have faced this extreme weather and all of the impacts together many, many, many times before. So we know that throughout our history, these events like floods, fires, earthquakes have pulled people together for collective action and community building. The rebuilding of downtown came after a major events. So with all of that in mind and having heard about that history of coming together and rebuilding and coming, building community, and now with the stage set by Dr. Mantua for what lies ahead, I'd now like to invite Dr. Tiffany Wise-West to join us. She is a civil engineer and the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz, and she'll talk about how we as a community can now face climate change together. So, Dr. Wise-West.
Thanks, Felicia. And we are so fortunate to have scientists and researchers like these two, as well as many others, that we can take that science and utilize for climate adaptation here in Santa Cruz. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using that science, what we are doing as a city with our community, and how you can get involved. And I'll be touching upon some of the stuff that happened out on West Cliff Drive. So to kind of boil it down, because of our geography, our geology, and so forth, we are subject to so many hazards, as both the speakers before me have mentioned. And these have cascading impacts, right? Health issues, potentially, with high heat. Those are summarized here on the left-hand side. Water contamination, saltwater intrusion. So there are a multitude of hazards, natural hazards, that are exacerbated by climate change that have these cascading impacts. And in fact, we've estimated the social cost of those climate hazards exceeds $25 million here in Santa Cruz already, and that's probably a low figure. This QR scan tag takes you to our climate adaptation planning page if you're interested. We've done quite a bit of work over the years. So I want to share that with you because I think a lot of people don't realize the city actually was a kind of an early adopter of climate adaptation and producing one of the first climate adaptation plans in the state. In the early 2000s, we started our first effort at a West Cliff Drive management plan to try to start to grapple with what this impending kind of looming hazards that we were expecting. It didn't make it through City Council or to the Coastal Commission, but as you'll see later on, we kept trying. And in 2011, we produced our first climate adaptation plan with, I believe, Gary Griggs and Brent Haddad, right? And that was the first time we really started to characterize the temporal and spatial extent of our climate hazards in our community, and then start to build strategies to be able to deal with that, to adapt. Fast forward to 2017, we completed our first sea level rise vulnerability assessment, as well as a social vulnerability to climate change assessment, really trying to understand where's the intersection of social vulnerability and these climate hazards, and how can we tailor solutions to make sure that we're helping those among us who have challenges already. So our first sea level rise vulnerability assessment, and most of this work has been done with local consultants, local researchers, and academia. Again, we're so fortunate for that. That sea level rise vulnerability assessment projected out coastal storm flooding, rising tide or sea level rise, and erosion at 3 different time horizons out to the end of the century, 2030, 2060, and 2100. But more on time horizons in a moment, because as we've seen, the future is now. We incorporated those assessments into our second climate adaptation plan update that was produced in 2018. Those adaptation plans are completed in coordination with our local hazard mitigation plan. And together, although they're standalone documents, we couple them together with the adaptation plan as an appendix to the LHMP. And when the local hazard mitigation plan is certified by FEMA, which all of ours have been, it makes us eligible for certain categories of pre and post hazard mitigation funding, of which we take significant advantage of. So it really is in our best interest to stay on top of the science, to do the studies, and make sure that we're really constantly revising and iterating on our planning. And we get questions a lot, like, why do you have to do another study? Why? Honestly, we have to do the studies to be able to base our proposals for grants, for example, on. If we don't have a basis to draw from, we're not going to get the funding. So that's something I often hear, why another study? But that's one of the reasons. So after we completed the climate adaptation plan, we wanted to take another crack at the West Cliff Drive plan. And we also knew that our local coastal program, which is our policy document that's certified by the California Coastal Commission to be consistent with the Coastal Act, so how we allow the coastline to be developed. That also needed to be updated to include sea level rise policies, which the Coastal Commission has long been advocating for. So together we tackled these 2 big projects under the name of Resilient Coast Santa Cruz. And what we produced out of that was the West Cliff Drive Adaptation and Management Plan, which was adopted in 2021 by our City Council. Hasn't made it through Coastal Commission yet, but we're still trying. And then we're still working on that local coastal program amendment to integrate those sea level rise policies in kind of a beaches and bluff chapter. So that's still happening. And that's still under revision right now. We also, and I'm going to share more on all of this and kind of show some pictures and stuff, but we're also developing a coastal change monitoring program and network. Our local coastal program and our West Cliff Drive plan both call for mechanisms to monitor the coastline so that we're able to really incorporate that into a decision-making tool and get into a proactive mode with managing our coastline. And lastly, I'm getting ready to start our 3rd climate adaptation plan update and local hazard mitigation plan update. We're waiting for some funding from FEMA to do that. And I'm going to talk about later on how it's going to be a little bit different than what we've done in the past. In fact, drawing upon the prior 2 speakers, really focusing on a combination of hazards, like what happened in Santa Barbara where they had a long-term drought, followed by a fire, followed by a 500-year storm and a landslide. We need to be thinking in that mode versus individual hazards. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. And again, long history of adaptation plans. Our current plan has 44 strategies. They're prioritized. I just gave an update to City Council in the fall. We've actually either have ongoing or have completed 40 of those strategies. So a lot of progress going on here on the adaptation plan. Yeah, thank you, that's awesome. I usually get the claps. I have to give a big shout out to our fire department, first of all, and I think one of our folks are in the crowd here. They've done a ton on wildfire management and, or on vegetation management for wildfire prevention. They've gotten 8 grants over the past few years to do that work. It's really been astounding. And as you're going to see in a moment, they're also working with the community on building fire-wise communities in those risky areas. Number 2, I also want to highlight our water department. Our water department is on the leading edge of understanding how climate change will affect water supply and the future investments they need to make. They've done some really outstanding work, and they have a great 5-minute video that summarizes it. So big shout out there to them as well. And of course, there's a lot going on across all of our departments, but those are 2 really notables right now. And I want to make sure that you know that the top 2 strategies relate to kind of what we're doing here today and on an ongoing basis, is really increasing public awareness and education opportunities, and then evaluating all of our decisions through a climate lens, which has recently been reinforced through our Health in All Policies initiative, which is kind of a weird name for prioritizing equity, public health, and sustainability in all of our decision making. And we have a number of mechanisms in place to ensure that that happens. So these are our top 2 strategies in the adaptation plan. As I mentioned, working with the community, making sure folks feel prepared or at least have an awareness and understanding of the risks, as have been described previously, super important. So we help to produce but also promote other guides and so forth for the community. On the right-hand side, that is what our fire department is utilizing for wildfire preparation and emergency evacuation. And on the left-hand side is something we just produced with the Beach Flats community. We've been spending a lot of time in the Beach Flats Lower Ocean community, which, as has been shown, is a very low-lying area. It's subject to nuisance flooding, although when flooding happens, I don't think it's really a nuisance, but that's what we call it. And we worked with the community to develop this, we're calling it an emergency preparedness fact sheet, but it's actually a multi-page document that the residents help us to develop that says, okay, this is what needs to be in your emergency kit, your emergency go kit. And it has a family emergency planning guide. Here's our meeting point, so forth and so on. So this is a really important part of this, in addition to the studies and the infrastructure work and so forth that we're doing. And we also we have produced, and particularly for our coastal work, a lot of learning and feedback tools. We have something called Climate Hazards to Solution Story Maps, which are online kind of visualizations that look at 7 segments of our coastline. They show you those projections for those coastal hazards I mentioned, erosion, rising tide, and coastal storm flooding. They talk through what are the possible solutions that we have, what are the trade-offs. There are a lot of trade-offs, as we've kind of touched on already today. And what do you think? There's a survey in there. So I highly recommend that. This QR scan tag takes you to our Resilient Coast Santa Cruz page where you can find these tools. And then you can see in the lower right-hand side, this is our Sea Level Rise Santa Cruz Virtual Reality Explorer app. So this is available in Spanish and English on your computer, on your mobile phone, or if you've got those really nifty Oculus headsets, you can use that as well. And Gary was the narrator on the English side of it, and one of our community organizers, Ernestina Saldano, on the Spanish side of it. What's really great about this tool is it allows you to be in control of adjusting sea level rise. It's super immersive, and you can contrast it with what a king tide looks like. It also builds in some of those solutions at Mitchell's Cove, down on Cowell and Main Beach, and it kind of lets you see, hey, if we put a seawall up here, we're not going to have a beach in 100 years down in Maine, or sooner. I mean, I'm saying 100, but could be sooner. And then again, what do you think about this? So for us, these are learning tools, but also feedback mechanisms that we can look at over time. And where are people at with these different solutions? Because I will tell you, many people want different things, and we don't have community consensus on some of the solutions that are available, despite the fact that we have built back many, many times, and we're grappling with the choices that were made in the past, and how do we go forward? So I just want to dive into the West Cliff Drive plan for just a moment. There's a number of things that were contained in that plan on the left-hand side. In general, the strategy with this plan is let us do one more round of repairing our riprap, potentially putting a seawall in at Mitchell's Cove, which is where all that damage occurred. while we build support for moving back from the coastline. So we left open in this plan as future options, things like hard armoring, but also moving back from the coastline, which we know our regulating agency, the Coastal Commission, really wants us to do. So that's at the very top here, the upgrade of existing protective structures. The things that are in bold, which is that sand management feasibility study, living shoreline and nature-based solutions. We're working on that right now, as well as a coastal change monitoring network. All these other things also are programmed out for the next 10 years, but with what's happened on West Cliff Drive, it's changed things quite a bit. And these are maybe their priorities, but also what is going to be the plan going forward. Because as I mentioned, there is a lack of community consensus on some of these areas. There is some regulatory uncertainty about what we can and can't do. And also we need to have the political will to make the hard choices. So this is the kind of greater Mitchell's Cove area. I got to give props to USGS who helped us to do this analysis. They had flown aerial photogrammetry before and after the storm, fortunately. And we found that 5,000 tons of rock and bluff have eroded from just this area of West Cliff Drive. And the red color shows the areas with more slippage and erosion, and the yellow areas are those with less. Incidentally, 3 of these riprap sites, we had just completed the design to repair them in December. And we had, unfortunately, the storm come in, which has caused us to revise those designs, which are actually complete. So really, the future is now, and I want to talk about here the fact that, you know, I mentioned in the beginning that we're trying to get away from time horizons because the rate of climate change, the rate of sea level rise is very uncertain. Are we going to get our global emissions in check and slow things down? Or is it going to continue at a really accelerated pace? How do we deal with that uncertainty? That is a big question. So we've adopted this framework that utilizes triggers and thresholds to signal when we need to transition to a next strategy. So we're not making investments too late or potentially too early, but that's a little more difficult to conceptualize. And we're trying to get away from these time horizons that we were previously thinking about. Because I will tell you, as you're going to see on the next slide, we had thresholds that we thought we weren't going to experience for 30 years that happened in this one storm, or this series of storms, this bomb cyclone event. So the future is here now. So here's what those thresholds that were exceeded in this Mitchell's Cove area. We already knew that our armoring integrity was compromised, and we were working on that. In the medium term, both our cliff erosion and our loss of public use or access thresholds were exceeded, which indicated we needed to go to a seawall solution. And again, this is just Mitchell's Cove, but we have these triggers and thresholds built out for our entire coastline. And in fact, we're building out right now social triggers. You know, what kind of social conditions do we need to monitor related to coastal climate change? And then lastly, in the long term, we had our frequency of repair and cost threshold had been exceeded, which told us we needed to start moving away from the coastline and start planning for that. We've blown through all of these, so right now everything's on the table. So right now, what are we working on in response to this specific event? We are working on the emergency funding and of course the associated bureaucratic processes that come with that. Y'all have probably been out there, and you'll see on my next slide, the one lane, one way, which really gives us an opportunity to pilot what pulling back from the coastline might look like. And we know that homeowners are concerned about traffic and parking and so forth, so we're putting monitoring in place for that as well. Our council just approved this on Tuesday, retroactively, the one lane, one way, and we're hoping to be able to experiment with kind of different configurations of that at different areas so that we can, you know, how does this work for our community when we need to go to that, and potentially it will stay, you know, so that has, none of that's been decided. We're working on the permitting. We're operating on emergency permit right now. And we're doing a lot of events like this and community engagement. We had a webinar on the 13th of February. We produced a question and answer sheet that's getting published, I think, by the end of the week, that has a lot of details about, people have a lot of questions about what's happened out there. And we're planning on doing a number of small kind of neighborhood meetings, as well as kind of once a month bigger meetings, and then going to be producing a recovery roadmap. I'm not going to talk about the one lane, one way, but partial closure, partial one lane, one way, and just a warning that the coastline continues to be dynamic. It got very saturated, it got very battered, and I think we all saw at Steamer Lane, we had a big van-sized chunk come off 3 weeks ago, and here's the fissure right above that, which is probably 4 times bigger. So a huge safety issue, and we have to really caution people about our coastline. So my last slide here, what's ahead beyond kind of this recovery piece? Well, again, in the adaptation plan and the LHMP, the combination of hazards I mentioned, I think I talked to our emergency operations manager who's here in the crowd, and I asked him about high heat, and he said, before 5 years ago, we never thought we'd have to think about high heat, but we're going to need to be doing some analysis on that. Always trying to look for nature-based solutions and ecologically oriented strategies, and always also trying to tie together to our community well-being metrics and that people piece. And on the coastal side of things, I've kind of already mentioned those. And man, are we chugging along to try to snag our share of the grants that are coming down from the Infrastructure Act, from IRA. And we're really well positioned because of all of this work to pull down that funding. So if you want to be engaged, especially on the coastal issues, cityofsantacruz.com/Westcliff traffic controls. We're going to be with our VR goggles at the Extreme Weather Resource Fair coming up on Saturday, and lots more to come. So I hope that gives you a flavor of what's going on here at the city. Lots to come, and this will be ongoing conversation for all time, really. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Tiffany. I'm so grateful for all of your work, and especially for your efforts to really involve the community in planning and preparing. It's really wonderful. We're going to jump into Q&A in just a few minutes, but from the natural history side, I wanted to just take a moment to briefly note that as much as we're focused tonight on how our human communities are facing climate change, it's also important to keep in mind that the changing climate is also reshaping natural habitats and ecosystems as well. And of course, nature will persist, but natural communities will certainly change. Just like people, plants and animals will either need to move or adapt, or else they might not survive here. Global projections from the IPCC predict that over 1 million plant and animal species are at risk of extinction due to climate change globally, and that includes over 300 species local to California. Should these species die off, others might take their place, and the California of the future might just look really different than it does today, from the human perspective and from the natural perspective. Many of the environmental changes that Nate described will dramatically affect local ecosystems. Diminishing fog, for example, will impact the many unique flora and fauna, like our famous redwood forests that depend on it. Drought obviously has impacts across many habitat types, so it can weaken and kill trees, interrupt life cycles, basically trigger cascading effects that ripple out across ecosystems. Or in the ocean, climate change is already driving behavioral shifts, like causing whales to come closer to shore to feed, where they then get entangled in fishing gear. There are many, many, many examples of how climate change that's affecting humans is also dramatically affecting our natural communities as well. And some organisms are more resilient or adaptable. There are plants, for example, that are adapted to disturbances like fire and drought, and we've seen a proliferation of so-called far-falling plants and fungi. And for some creatures, warming conditions may even benefit their populations. It's really a mixed bag. And so naturalists who are keeping a close eye on wildlife are seeing some surprising changes already. And as we're keeping an eye on nature, and we see flora and fauna struggling to adapt, as stewards and cohabitants, we must take action to conserve and protect them. But as we see those certain species unexpectedly thriving, I think we should also pay close attention. They might just hold a secret that we can learn from. Nature does hold many solutions that we would be wise to heed, either literally by teaming up with the environment, like with the living shorelines that Tiffany mentioned, or through creative approaches like biomimetic design inspired by adaptations and strategies that we can observe in nature. And clearly, humans are very adaptable and resilient creatures to have thrived on this landscape since time immemorial. But now, as the change of pace is picking up, we will need to remember the lessons of the past, continue to learn through study and experience, and plan for what lies ahead, which is, again, why I'm so grateful to have this community of such incredible people who are studying and planning and preparing for all of us to continue to thrive here. So again, thank you to our speakers. I'd like to invite you to come on up. More chairs will appear for you, I'm sure. And we're going to get started with our Q&A. You don't need to come all the way down the stairs. You can just pass your cards. Staff will be coming up to help gather your questions. And if you could just leave the aisles clear for our staff to go up and down and get those questions, that would be great. And we'll do our best to address as many as we can. We've got plenty of time tonight. So, Tiffany, you mentioned that we have been grappling with decisions of the past, and clearly, Gary, we've seen images of the same things being built over and over and over again. Are there examples of strategies that have been working? And will those continue to be solutions even with the climate future that's been described?
Well, it's interesting, if you ask maybe our engineers, they said, well, where the riprap was, still designed, it worked. And, with unlimited money, we could do that forever, right? But that has a lot of trade-offs, right? We will lose our pocket beaches, we're sitting on intertidal and tidal zone and habitat and so forth. So that maybe isn't the way to think about that, of course. We do have a great example of a living shoreline over at Seabright Beach. That's actually a state beach, but Groundswell Coastal Ecology, Dr. Bill Henry, has really been leading that charge, and there's been a wonderful accretion of sand on that beach, lots of habitat, very successful. So there's kind of a contrast between a hard and a green solution.
Right. And Gary, looking through all those historic photos, did you see any that stood out as persistent good solutions? Or are you just looking for the crumbled photos? You're looking for the real estate targets.
People have accused me of loving disasters, which isn't really true, but it's interesting as a geologist, you spend your whole life looking at outcrops, rocks and sea cliffs and in road cuts trying to figure out what happened here. Why do we have whale fossils and mollusks in the rocks of, Depot Hill? And a disaster, you can see what's happening in real time. You can see what happens with the flood, what happens with the volcanic eruption. So that's sort of the interest is real-time geology. But you asked a really good question, and I think it's sort of contrary to everything I showed tonight. I mean, Felton Grove might be the best example. Capitola is a good example. We just go back to the same places and do it again. Even the flood control project on the San Lorenzo was, it's worked, but we still have a problem if we get a big flood because the way the channel was built, it's filled up with sediment. It's not going to contain a 100-year flood. So the Corps of Engineers isn't my favorite agency. We're also dredging the harbor on a regular basis because of, once you decide to put the harbor there, you're going to have to deal with the sand. It wasn't so much how they built it, but where they built it. So everything we've done to date, I would call a Band-Aid. And we, at some point, have to start looking further ahead besides just patching up And climate change has changed the whole configuration. And as Nate pointed out, we're getting more variability, more extremes. And you get people say, well, it's snowing. Obviously, global warming isn't happening. You say, there's a difference between weather and climate. And climate is long-term, what you predict, and weather is what you get. And we're going to get lots of variability. So because it's snowing today doesn't mean the planet isn't warming. And as Nate pointed out, the ocean's getting warmer. So I wish I could give you a great example, but I think we're sort of stretching to find one here so far.
Wondering if we have audience questions ready. Yeah? All
Yeah,
right.
don't feel like you have to stay here for us.
So this one's for Nate. In the Monterey Bay, what are some of the organisms natively that, wait. What are some of the organisms that have been impacted by warming waters?
Yeah, so you may have heard of kelp forest declines that have been widespread along central Northern California coast, especially in recent years. And that was a really interesting set of events that brought this situation upon us. In 2013, people working in the intertidal started seeing sea stars, Pycnopodia, dying at really high rates. They're turning to mush. They called it sea star wasting disease. And it was not just a local problem, it extended all the way into British Columbia. And they are a top predator of a lot of shellfish in the intertidal, out to depths that go pretty far off the coastline. And the sea star wasting disease took out almost all the animals on the west coast, all the way into British Columbia. And that meant that things like purple sea urchins didn't have a major predator to keep them in check. And some really interesting research shows that when those urchins are in the presence of this top predator, they tend to hide in cracks and crevices, but when the predators go away, they come out and swarm kelp beds and kelp forests, and they consume them down to the algae. And then they start consuming the algae on the rocks, and they leave what is called urchin barrens. So that then also impacted the things that depend on the kelp, like abalone. And our abalone stocks crashed in response to that. So on the north coast of California, where there has been a long history of an abalone fishery, and it sort of weathered the problems in abalone in central and southern California that played out earlier, they're decimated now, and all those fisheries are closed. So we had a whole cascade, these we call trophic cascades of that disease, then the loss of sea stars. The marine heat wave made things even more difficult for kelp because it reduced the nutrients and thermally stressed the kelp, and the urchins ate what was there. So this is pretty dramatic, and there are some other things that really suffer that typically do well in the colder, really productive times of the California current. Our Pacific salmon on the west coast really struggled through those warm years. They didn't all disappear, but their abundances really declined, and their productivity really declined. And that's also happened to a number of our seabird populations that are out feeding on things like krill. And you mentioned this really interesting thing that has happened in recent years with the entanglement of whales in our fisheries, in particular the Dungeness crab fishery, which is one of the most important commercial fisheries on the west coast, that during that marine heat wave period, krill had been really scarce, and krill tend to be especially abundant out on the shelf break and the canyon heads. So we have big canyons like Monterey Canyon that comes right up to Moss Landing area, but other canyons were super productive places for humpback whales to come and forage when the krill are there. But the krill had been really scarce, and at the same time, we started to see abundant anchovy congregations in shallower water. So the humpback whales moved into that shallow water, fed on the anchovies, but that was right on top of the crab gear. So this really dramatic shift in where they were because of changes in the food web, and not a very simple story. You have multiple pieces at play at once. And this kind of situation just shows how connected everything is. And it's really difficult to like look at one species at a time and look at the habitat and think you're going to understand what is going to happen out there in the ocean.
Okay, thank you. That's also a really interesting connection because, of course, then the fishery gets closed down, right? And so these things affecting the natural ecosystems are not at all isolated from the human impacts to our communities as well. Thank you. So I'm not sure who wants to take this one on. This question is, how did extensive logging in the late 19th and early 20th centuries impact those earlier floods that you described, Gary? So a lot of logging obviously destabilizes soil. How did that play out?
Next question. Well, I think we're in a very different situation today because what logging is done is selective logging. We take out, trees, and Big Creek lumber, sort of the, I don't know, maybe a national leader in good forest practices. But in the old days, if you've seen the pictures of San Lorenzo Valley, you could see from Boulder Creek down to the mouth of the San Lorenzo almost, it was completely clear cut. So we lost a lot of soil. I'm sure it didn't help the fisheries. Things have regrown, and it also, we went through in the 40s and 50s a lot of grading and house site development and subdivisions. There was a huge sort of mess in Zayani. City built our reservoir on Newell Creek, our one reservoir, Loch Lomond, and on a parallel drainage is Zayani Creek, and the city bought that, logged the entire drainage basin, and then, for whatever reasons, they weren't quite ready, didn't have the money to build the dam. Now it's never going to be built. There's also a fault that runs through it, but I mean, there's development there, houses, but clear cutting it led to a lot of sediment downstream. So I think our sediment loads were probably much higher in the streams then than they are today. And things have recovered.
Yeah, there's some things that I can add to that that relate back to what our rivers look like and how that affects our fish populations. That during that intensive logging period and even since that time, we removed all the big trees out of the stream channels. And those big trees would tend to form habitats by creating big pools that slowed the water down and spread it out onto the benches and the floodplains. And removing all that wood has sped up the flow. It has led to more erosion in the channel itself. So the streams you can see virtually everywhere in coastal California have what we call down cut, and they become incised deeper and deeper into the channel, and they become disconnected from their floodplains. So in that way, it has maybe reduced some of the local flood risk, and it's created new mini floodplains within these incised channels. And there's some really neat work that was done here at UCSC about that area around Felton and Henry Cowell, that it does have a new floodplain. It's just a really small, incised and sunken floodplain within the existing channel. But what that also does is it drains water out of the floodplain, that the water table drops as the stream elevation drops. So you're dehydrating the landscapes around our streams. And salmon and steelhead that historically were just super productive here in this part of the world, they need those floodplain areas to have places where they can grow and get out of the big flood events and sort of hide and eat all the bugs and the worms and things that come up once they're inundated. So it's super important growth habitat and refuge from high flows that they don't have access to. And then our vegetation is also water stressed because of the lowered water table. And that is something that has happened throughout the West that actually offers some potential green solutions to mitigate future flood risks, to improve the water storage on the landscape, to improve fish and wildlife habitat. And there are really neat projects happening in the Central Valley to reconnect some floodplains and to provide space for the big floods that, already cause a lot of damage where we have development, and to provide better fish and wildlife habitat.
Cool. So kind of connecting the dots between the logging and vegetation and floodplains, with this next question, also connecting to the living shoreline idea in the plan. Does that living shoreline plan, is that only along the coast, or does that include reestablishing floodplains and vegetative management all along the river? Or, how far up does that go?
Sure, so we have not yet completed our kind of living shoreline nature-based solutions feasibility study for the coastline yet. So, we do think there are opportunities potentially at the river mouth, on Main Beach, in a limited kind of way there. But it's interesting, just yesterday, we met with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who I know some people were kind of like, but they're really interested to come in and help the city. They have a number of different authorities, both on the coastal and the river side, and that topic came up. What is the opportunity for nature-based solutions within the floodplain? There have been ideas floated about reclaiming marsh and wetland down around the river mouth, the lagoon area, and providing better habitat for coho and so forth. So there are a lot of ideas floated. I think the jury's out on, we really need to do that kind of nose to the grindstone work to understand where the opportunities lie. Of course, we are working to the extent possible within what was the core prescriptions and now will be the FEMA prescriptions for how we can maintain vegetation along the river. We are going through FEMA certification. We're almost finished. We've been doing that for 3 years of the levee, which helps to maintain, actually it cuts those who have national flood insurance, they participate in the national flood insurance program. Their rates are cut in half if we can maintain a FEMA certified or accredited levee system. So there's not anything like active happening, but definitely more on the horizon there.
If I can add something.
Please.
We're so green in Santa Cruz and organic, right? If it's got a green label on it, we're going to buy it. And I think we're now in this point where we're hearing a lot about living shorelines. And to put that put a little maybe realism in there, places like the margins of San Francisco Bay, perhaps, where it's very low energy, we can plant things that may help forestall sort of the shoreline retreating. And in tropical environments, mangroves and coral are very good sort of organic solutions. But if you look at West Cliff, or most of the 1,100 miles of California coast that's cliffed and rocky, we don't have things that grow there that are going to make a difference. So I'm just trying to be realistic and say you can't put a living shoreline on West Cliff Drive. You saw the pictures of those waves. In the back of Seabright, you're right, it's stable, we've got dunes there, and it's because we built a jetty to the harbor and we trap 4 or 5 million cubic yards of sand, and it's okay until we have a big storm and we can erode that again. So we want to have living shorelines and organic solutions, but there's a lot of places where we have to be realistic and say we just can't plant a mangrove on West Cliff or plant coral.
That is so true, and the one thing I will say is, where can we integrate natural solutions and say, like, if ultimately there is a seawall in Mitchell's Cove, how about integrating bird perches and microhabitat environments and treatments? It's kind of a gray-green solution. It's not a purely green solution, but, if that's the direction that we take, those are some things that we can consider. And, the feasibility work needs to be done on that.
I've got a geology question for you. Are we running out of sand? And where does the sand that replenishes local beaches come from?
Where does our sand come from on our beaches? About 90% of it in California comes from rivers and streams, and we've dammed a lot of dams on a lot of streams, particularly Southern California. And globally, we've got a sand problem. There's a wonderful movie out called Sand Wars. And it talks about this global search for sand, for concrete in large part. But everything we use has silica in it. Glass and computers and phones and cosmetics all have silica in them. So there's a shortage. And it's surprising, we've looked a lot at the beaches of California. In some places, bluffs eroding add sand to the beach. particularly in San Diego County, where we don't have a lot of big rivers, and the cliffs happen to be fairly sandy. Here, we've got the mudstone. It doesn't contribute much to the beaches. So our long-term studies show in many cases the beaches oscillate in width with El Nino years and in calm years. So we're not really running out, but it's not always in the places where we would like it to be. So we've got a great Seabright beach, and right now we have a new beach between the lane and Cowles, which happens in El Nino years or when storms come from the southwest. But there's places in Southern California where there's no beach, and a lot of Westcliff has no beach. So there's Save Westcliff is trying to think of a way to build outcrops into groins to trap sand. More on that coming.
And I know you have a whole class on that, the river of sand. So this one's probably for you, Nate. How are these storm impacts predicted to affect fisheries recruitment? So again, connecting to the kind of economic impacts of all of this.
Yeah, so this idea of recruitment, if you haven't heard that word applied to fish, is basically just bringing new fish into the population to where they're big enough to catch again. And that's a kind of a fisheries science term. And storms, individual storms that become especially volatile, like we've had experience this winter, can be very difficult on our stream fish just because of the high energy environment and the lack of places to duck out of the high energy. And in fact, I was walking on the beach at Rio Del Mar around New Year's before the really big storm. And yet there were some big storms that preceded that, and all the wrack on the beach. And sure enough, my daughter, 11 years old, always finding things, hands me a juvenile steelhead that had died, washed up on the beach. And I think, well, this is the kind of thing that you expect to happen with these super volatile storms and no good habitat to hide from them. So it's really difficult in our streams that are so degraded and lacking good hideaways. And out in the ocean, those kind of events are probably not as impactful. The ocean sort of really slows everything down, and especially our fish that are spawning out at great depth, they're sort of insulated from what's happening up at the top in the short term, but it's the sort of longer term processes that often can impact them. Although once they become larvae and they're subject to the currents, a lot of them are up near the surface, and then they do get swept around, and they can be swept offshore to where they aren't going to find the food they need to grow, or they'll bump into too many predators. So those kind of things can happen. But during that 2014, 15, 16 marine heat wave, it was a really interesting thing that was documented in our surveys looking at rockfish on our coast, that a lot of those rockfish populations did surprisingly well. And anchovies, if you have seen humpback whales lunge feeding on anchovies lately with them spilling out of their mouth, the anchovies population exploded in the last 8 years, and they're super abundant right now. So some fish species, and you mentioned this, actually did really well in recent years, while others not so much.
Interesting. Another question about kind of where things come from. Where does the riprap that we use locally come from?
We were just talking about this.
A long way away.
Yeah.
You'd think with all the rocks we have around here, it would work, but we don't have rocks that break down into 2, 5. A lot of it comes, I think, from way down in the Salinas Valley. Originally, a lot of the rock, like for the Half Moon Bay breakwater, came from the Sierra. They brought it down in railroad cars and put on barges, but it's expensive to haul things because you have to bring in the Teamsters Union. And it seems easy, I'll just get some rocks, but those rocks might be $500 a piece or $1,000 a piece. There's no free lunches.
All right. We're nearly at the end of our questions. Do we have to choose between protecting homes on Westcliff and protecting our downtown? Is there enough money for both? We're ending on a high note here, folks.
Where's the mayor?
Maybe.
Yeah, where's the mayor?
Pass.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a question I can really answer. answer, quite honestly. There's so much uncertainty and community conversation that needs to take place around all these issues, so.
All right,
Pass.
we'll accept
Yeah.
that. So maybe we'll end here. This goes to each of you. Given all that we've been talking about, what gives you hope for the future of life along the coast?
I'll start.
Yeah.
I work a lot with UCSC Coastal Science and Policy Graduate Program, other students, and I'm constantly inspired and invigorated by their energy, their passion for this kind of work, and there's so many young people that are getting into this line of work. There's so many more jobs across the state that are available for coastal resilience kind of work, and it makes me hopeful. You know, I've got, you know, maybe a dozen years left in my career, but I'm really but I'm really hopeful, you know, with the folks that are coming up, that they're really ready to take this on and face these very daunting challenges.
I have two words I use often, two phrases. One is sober optimism. The other is aggressive incrementalism. So we keep moving forward. But I think it's an event like we've seen recently that should give us pause to stop and not keep doing the same thing over and over again. You probably heard this. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And Seacliff is an example where we've lost it 7 times. And Westcliff, this is big, more than anything I've seen in the time I've been here. So I think we're getting smarter, but we're also getting politically more polarized. And so no matter what comes up, there's going to be people fighting about it, whether it's desal or the Greenway. And that's, you know, I learned a long time ago from Bruce Van Allen, who was on the city council. He says, what I learned was the easiest thing to do when we have a problem, and it could be Westcliff, anything, is we draw a line, you get on that side and we get on this side and we punch it out. He says, what you have to do is draw a circle and put everybody inside of it and figure out what you have in common and how do we sort of work towards common solutions. My bit of wisdom.
Hopeful wisdom.
Yeah, I don't think I can
Oh, come on.
go too far beyond that idea that drawing the circle and bringing people in. I do think that does offer us our best hope, because in many of these situations we do know what would lead to better outcomes for a community. And this tension between private property rights and the well-being of the community is really amplified. But when conditions become so difficult, we often see that's when people come together. And I, pay a lot of attention to California water resources because it's such a crucial part of what happens to our salmon and steelhead that we work on in the lab I am at. And it's really the only time California makes progress on dealing with drought is about 3 or 4 years into a multi-year painful drought that brings everybody to the table. And sometimes the worst thing that can happen for progress is a heavy rain year like we have right now, because people forget. And they go back and say, oh, we're all good again. But the realization today is that we're not good. That something that, I see the media covering the amount of water that's going to sea, it's not being trapped and held onto, and is the drought over because it's raining every day? But we have this huge groundwater deficit that's been built up over decades that we can't just flip the switch on. And that has been the mechanism that has kept California's irrigated agriculture booming through recent decades. They've been able to keep pumping groundwater, but it's getting deeper and deeper and more expensive to get to, and drying up wells all around the margins, and different farmers are seeing that, my neighbor just drained my water supply. And so we have a state groundwater management act now, and it doesn't have to be fully implemented until 2040, gives people a lot of time. But this kind of crisis, this chronic crisis, is forcing people to the table and having conversations that just haven't been possible to have before. And I think it's gonna allow some of younger generations to come in and help turn the tide. And the other thing, getting back to what Tiffany said, I've got 2 young children, and they just seem so tuned in to what's happening around the world in a way that I was not at their age. And I see the kids that they're with and the schools teach so much more broadly into these contemporary issues in a way that, you know, I didn't get until I got into my career. And it just gives me some hope that the awareness will just kind of keep pushing the line.
Okay.
We have to have hope.
Yeah, we'll end it on a hopeful note then. So thank you all for your talks tonight and for the wonderful questions. Let's have another round of applause for our speakers.